our, I'll start again. I don't know if I was recorded. We're recording this on March 24, 2022, and I want to welcome everybody to another one of our fabulous monthly colloquia. Dave Roloff and Louise Matthews have brought us thought-provoking and intellectually stimulating, excuse the phone, intellectually stimulating programs throughout our fall and winter terms. I'm glad to see there's so many of us here today. This is a really important and timely discussion. And I'm pleased that the pandemic has allowed us to continue these colloquia in a way that serves our community. And
Barbara, good afternoon. It's Ike, individual Phil.
Gosh. Anyway, I'm sorry about the phone interruption, and I want to take this opportunity to one, remind you to register. This is the time to register for classes. And also, I want to turn this over now to our colloquium co-chair, Dave Roloff. Dave?
Okay, my name is Dave Roloff, and hopefully whoever's calling Barbara won't call me next.
Me too, I hope that too.
So Louise Matthews and I are co-chairs of the colloquium committee in this go-round, and we're really happy today to bring Susan D. Anderson to our colloquium. She is the history curator and program manager at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles and a member of the editorial board of California History Journal. Previously, she was the director of collections, library exhibitions and programs at California Historical Society in San Francisco, as well as the interim chief curator at the African American Museum and Library in Oakland, and the curator of collecting Los Angeles at UCLA Library Special Collections. For decades, she has brought her scholarly interest in California's hidden African American history to her writing, lectures, public history projects. Today, she will discuss portions of her upcoming book, African Americans and the California Dream, a first ever history of California African Americans and their transforming effect on civic life in the state from the gold rush to Black Lives Matter. So I am so very happy to introduce Susan D. Anderson. And
thank you so much, Dave.
You're up.
All righty. What I have done is to take advantage of the last few days of Women's History Month. And today's talk is going to focus on sharing some histories of African American women throughout California's past who have helped shape our state. And I was especially glad to choose this angle on the history. Over the last few days, I have been riveted by the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings on the nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so I'm hoping that this will show us history, but also feel relevant to today. And let's go ahead and see if we can start moving these slides. Just let me make sure that I've got it together here. Deeds Not Words, in honor of Women's History Month. I'm going to introduce you to some African American women whose lives and work have helped shape California history. We're going to look first in the 19th century at figures who arrived in California during gold rush days, and their bravery personifies the quote from one of the women we'll meet today, who said, "I'd rather be a corpse than a coward." This is a photograph of Nancy and Peter Gooch on their wedding day in Coloma, El Dorado County in 1857. And for those of you who remember your fourth grade California history lessons, Coloma, El Dorado County is where James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in 1848. Nancy and Peter arrived in California as enslaved people. Their son Andrew had been sold to another slaveholder before they made the journey from Missouri with their slaveholder William Gooch. Nancy and Peter bought their freedom in 1850 and began farming and buying land in Coloma. After many years of searching, and also after her husband Peter died, Nancy was reunited with her son Andrew Monroe, his wife Sarah, and their children. And the family under Andrew's leadership began amassing more than 600 acres in Coloma with fruit orchards and groves of fir trees. And what you're looking at here is a picture of a house that was built by Pearlie Monroe, who was Andrew's eldest son and Nancy's eldest grandchild. It's next to a blacksmith shop that Pearlie also built. And these buildings are still standing in Coloma, and they're part now of Marshall Gold Discovery State Historic Park. In the 1940s, when the state of California was putting together its final plans to open this park to commemorate the gold rush, they purchased the Monroe property. People don't realize that Marshall Gold Discovery Park and the most historic spots and lots on it are based on land that were owned by a Black family, the Monroe family. And that land also included the location of Sutter's Mill where gold was discovered. And as you can see, Nancy Ross Gooch was buried in Pioneer Cemetery in Coloma, El Dorado County. We're going to move south from El Dorado County down to San Francisco and Mary Ellen Pleasant. She is the source of our quote for this morning. Toward the end of her life, she wrote in her autobiography, "My cause was the cause of freedom and equality for myself and for my people, and I'd rather be a corpse than a coward." And she was referring to the many risks she took throughout her work. Mary Ellen Pleasant was one of the wealthiest women in San Francisco. She brought a fortune with her when she arrived in 1852 with her husband and daughter. She invested in gold mines and real estate. She operated boarding houses, laundries, and restaurants. This is one of her mansions in San Francisco before it was torn down in 1927. Mary Ellen Pleasant used her wealth in the battle for freedom. She gave to anti-slavery causes, including helping John Brown finance his raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. In the 1860s and 70s, Pleasant was one of several African-American citizens of San Francisco who sued streetcar companies. And you can see here a nice photograph of an Omnibus Railroad streetcar. That was one of the companies that got sued several times by Black San Franciscans during this period. They were suing for these companies for the racial discrimination that was practiced in the cars. In all of the cases that I've read, the conductors either refused to stop and pick up Black passengers, or once they discovered Black passengers on a train, the conductors would throw them off. Mary Ellen Pleasant did win her lawsuits in court, but it wasn't until the 1890 Dibble Civil Rights Act was passed by the state of California legislature that it would be illegal to discriminate based on race in public accommodations in the state. So now we come to Los Angeles, where a landmark court case in 1856 freed Biddy Mason and her family. Biddy Mason and her children had trekked with their Mormon slaveholders, Robert and Rebecca Smith, from Mississippi to Southern California. Smith, when he was ready to leave the state and take his family and the enslaved people in his party to Texas, he kept his captive Biddy and the other enslaved people, he kept them captive in the Santa Monica Mountains so that no one could get to them, he thought. But Biddy and Hannah, another woman who was in the party and among that family, had met free Black people in Los Angeles and San Bernardino who assured them that California was a free state. One of those people that worked with Biddy and Hannah was Robert Owen. He got the Los Angeles, and Robert Owen was a wealthy stable owner, business owner, African-American. He got the Los Angeles County Sheriff to bring a writ of habeas corpus, and Owen took 10 of the vaqueros that he employed in his stable business downtown Los Angeles and rode into the mountains and rescued Biddy, Hannah, and their families. During the court case, Biddy could not testify because California had a law prohibiting African Americans from testifying in court against whites. So the judge in the case, Benjamin Hayes, met with Biddy in his chambers. And at the end of the trial, he declared that according to California's Constitution, Biddy and her family were forever free, in his words. And what you're looking at here is a photograph of the Biddy Mason homestead in downtown Los Angeles in the 1860s or the 1870s. She worked as a nurse and a midwife, and with the help of Robert Owen, began buying real estate, investing in the future of Los Angeles. Then Los Angeles was a city of no more than 2,000 people. She became one of the wealthiest women west of the Mississippi, and a well-known philanthropist and a founder of First African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was originally built on land that she owned and is still flourishing in Los Angeles. And if you're interested, the Biddy Mason Memorial Park is on the site of her former homestead, the place that we just saw in the photograph. It's on Spring Street downtown between 4th and 5th. So we'll continue moving south to San Diego County, and America Newton, who was a former slave from Independence, Missouri. She arrived in Julian, San Diego County in 1872, and the San Diego area experienced its own gold rush almost 30 years after the rest of the state did. America Newton acquired 80 acres of land, a homestead in Julian, and also she acquired a horse and buggy to help her with travel and with her laundry business. As a washerwoman, America Newton was well known in town. She performed a vital function in gold country through her laundry business, and she was able to live an independent life and help develop the town of Newton. So we're going to move on to club women and starting in the early 20th century. African-American clubs, women's clubs were and are an important vehicle for philanthropic and social activism. And we're going to start with some individuals. This is Josephine Leavell Allensworth. She was born in Trenton, Kentucky, and became an accomplished pianist, organist, and music teacher. She married prominent Baptist minister, Reverend Allensworth, in the 1870s. And Allensworth became a chaplain in the United States Army in the 24th Infantry, one of the 4 regiments that became known as the Buffalo Soldiers. And for more than 20 years, Josephine and her husband and their 2 daughters were posted to frontier posts across the West. And she she was the organist during her husband's chapel services, and was known for making, even in the most remote and rugged terrain, was known for making an elegant home. After Colonel Allensworth retired in 1906 and they moved to Los Angeles, Josephine and Colonel Allensworth and a group of others based in Los Angeles founded an all-Black town of Allensworth, about 40 miles north of Bakersfield. And Josephine was very active in the town. She helped found the Women's Improvement League. She was on the school board. She donated the land that the library was built on. It was named after her mother. And Colonel Allensworth was killed in 1914 in a motorcycle accident. And she moved permanently back to Los Angeles and lived with her daughter Nella and her son-in-law, Louis Blodgett, who was one of the most successful Black contractors in LA, and lived with them until her death in 1938. Now, this, for those of us that have watched television in the late 1950s, this might be a familiar face. Film and television actress Louise Beavers. She began her film career in LA during the era of silent films. She was one of those lucky actors who worked regularly in film and television, primarily playing a maid to white female stars, the roles that were available in the kind of scripts that were written. But she did get a lot of notice in the 1934 adaptation of Imitation of Life, where she and Claudette Colbert both played working mothers. One of the things people who may know about her professional career may not know about Louise Beavers is that she was a club woman, and she was very prominent and active member of the community in Los Angeles. She was involved in the People's Independent Church, which was very politically active against discrimination in World War II defense industries in LA, and was involved in the development of Val Verde Park, which was an African-American resort. But she also made history in the 1940s. She was a resident of West Adams in the enclave that was known as Sugar Hill. And some of her neighbors included other actors like Hattie McDaniel, Ethel Waters, and Francis Williams, businessmen like Norman O. Houston, who helped found Golden State a Mutual Life Insurance Company, jazz musician Ben Carter, Pearl Bailey, many, many others. A very affluent neighborhood. But an association of white homeowners in West Adams sued the Black homeowners, demanding that the city enforce the racially restrictive housing covenants system. And Lauren Miller, who was a civil rights attorney, led the class action suit against the white homeowners. And the California Superior Court in 1945 issued a judgment stating that the Black plaintiffs had full rights guaranteed in the 14th Amendment. This case in California Superior Court, brought by these Black homeowners, including Louise Beavers, helped pave the way for Shelley versus Kramer, which was the 1948 Supreme Court decision that made it impossible to enforce racially restrictive housing covenants. So we'll move on now to the California Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, which you can see was in operation and active for many, many decades. There were branches of the Federation throughout the state and in every region of California. It was founded in 1906. This is a picture of the women at a meeting that was held in Oakland in 1915. They're representatives. It wasn't the entire federation, but they're representatives at a convention. And it's important to know that these women's clubs played a vital function in times when white institutions refused to serve African Americans. Black women's clubs were responsible for building daycare centers, old folks' homes, hospitals, and other institutions to serve their communities. Deeds, not words, was their motto. And this was also originally the motto of suffragist Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. And it demonstrates the Black women's feminism and their pragmatism. A club that was formed in 1939, the League of Allied Arts, by, on the left, educator Dorothy Vina, and on the right, social worker Juanita Miller. I mentioned Lauren Miller, the civil rights attorney. Juanita Miller was married to Lauren Miller, and Dorothy Vina was married to lawyer Ivan Johnson III. Dorothy's father, James Vina, was a founder of the Los Angeles NAACP in 1912. And the two women started the League of Allied Arts in 1939 to support African American artists. And this happened because their friend Langston Hughes, who Lauren Miller was one of Langston Hughes's best friends, the famous poet, and Langston Hughes came often to California, and he would stay in Silver Lake where Juanita and Lauren Miller had a home that is going to soon actually be given monument status. But they were working with Langston Hughes to find a venue, a theater that would agree to let them stage one of Hughes's plays. And because of discrimination, they could find none. So they ended up forming an organization to help their own artists. And the League has provided financial assistance to young African-American artists, going all the way back to the years when they supported painter Jacob Lawrence, who now is famous, who's in collections at the Met and other places. But when he was a young man, the League helped support him with a scholarship in the 40s, all the way to ballerina Misty Copeland, who grew up in a trailer in Long Beach and is now the first Black principal dancer in the American Ballet Theater. And the League is still going strong. And moving up to Sacramento, the Women's Civic Improvement Club was formed right after World War I. The women, African-American women in the city in Sacramento decided to confront the need for housing for minority women. At that time, because of racial segregation, housing opportunities were confined to the red light district. So the group began to provide housing. There were a lot of people coming into the state during and after World War I, and they helped provide housing and employment assistance to African-American women and other minority women. And one of the things they also did was start the first Head Start program in Sacramento, and they still operate that program. So we're going to talk about a few teachers, the bedrock of the community, looking at some early examples in California history. Here on your left is Elizabeth Thorne-Scott Flood. We're looking at some of California's earliest African-American teachers. They were educators when the law in California prohibited, Elizabeth Thorne-Scott Flood was an educator when the law in California actually prohibited African-American students from attending public schools at all. Then the law changed and prohibited African-Americans from attending white schools. Elizabeth Thorne-Scott Flood founded schools for colored children in Sacramento and Oakland, and she and her family actually became very influential in Oakland. And on the right, you see a photograph of Mary Sanderson. If you can make out, she's the tallest person among those children. And it was the daughter of an educator, Reverend Jeremiah B. Sanderson, who came to California from Bedford, Massachusetts during the gold rush. And this was a time, because of the ways that the laws were written, African-American parents and communities were building what were called colored schools around the state. Here in Los Angeles, Bessie Bruington made history. Her parents came from Kansas to Los Angeles by covered wagon in 1877, and they settled in North Hollywood, and that's where Bessie Bruington was born. She graduated from Polytechnic High School in 1911, and she attended college at Los Angeles State Normal School, which I'm sure you know is now UCLA. She graduated from college 7th in a class of 800. Her first teaching assignment was at Holmes Avenue School, where she was promoted to principal in 1918. You can see a picture on the left. She was the first African-American principal in the Los Angeles school system. And her efforts didn't come alone. There were campaigns and organizing, and her efforts to break the color bar in the faculty of LA Unified was supported by the Forum, which was an African-American civic organization that used to be headquartered at 8th and Wall Street downtown. And she served throughout her life in a number of civic organizations, the YWCA, the Native California Club, the Wilfendel Club, another Black women's club, which has historical status. They have a club building on Adams. She was in the Delta Sigma Theta sorority and the NAACP, and she worked for 44 years as an educator in LA Unified, and retired in 1955. Now, Bessie Bruington became the first Black principal in LA in 1918, but Blossom Lorraine Gholson, whom we're seeing here, became the first African-American teacher in the San Diego schools in 1942. They were behind on everything. The district was forced to open up during World War II. There was an influx of new students, and the schools were being crowded, and there was a shortage of male teachers. But she was the model candidate. She was a native Californian. She had degrees from San Diego City College and Columbia University. And when she died in 2015, at the age of 102, her obituary led with a verse from 2 Timothy, "I have fought a good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith." So we're going to close out with a look at some women who were involved in groundbreaking politics in California history. The world is in need of aggressive leadership, and aggressive leadership must come from the women. That is something said by Betty Hill of Los Angeles in 1947, and we'll meet her in a moment. We're looking at the first African-American on the Los Angeles Board of Education. Fay Allen was elected in 1939. One of the things that she was able to do while on the board was rename the McKinley School to George Washington Carver Middle School. And she was known for raising issues of the need for African-American teachers and counselors on what was nearly an all-white faculty and staff in the district. And the person that we quoted earlier about the need for women's aggressive leadership is Betty Hill. Betty Hill was a founder of the Los Angeles NAACP. She led the legal battle against the city of LA segregated public swimming pools. In 1926, the Playground Commission of the city of Los Angeles officially segregated its recreation centers and swimming pools. Black children were only allowed to use public swimming pools one afternoon of the week. Betty Hill's dear friend Ethel Priolo, and actually both of these women were, I mentioned the Buffalo Soldiers earlier, both of these women were married to officers in Buffalo Soldier regiments. Her good friend Ethel Priolo brought a lawsuit on behalf of her children who were prohibited from using the swimming pool in their neighborhood. And it took 5 years, but the court finally decided that the city had to desegregate its swimming pools. So that decision was handed down in 1931. In 1940, Betty Hill became the first Black female delegate from west of the Mississippi at the Republican National Convention. She fought racism and misogyny and championed civil rights through an organization she founded called the Women's Political Study Club. When she died, her obituary in the Los Angeles Sentinel read, "No history of political life in California can be written without a chapter or two devoted to her." Her former home on 37th Street is a historic monument. And we're going to move up to Berkeley before coming back to Southern California to end and talk just for a moment about Frances Albrier, who came to Berkeley, California as a young woman in 1920 and began nearly 6 decades of community activism while working as a nurse, maid, and union organizer. She actually ran as part of a community campaign as the first African-American candidate for Berkeley City Council in 1939. The color line wasn't broken on the Berkeley City Council until 20 years later in 1959. During World War II, after being denied work at the Kaiser shipyards, she fought for and won a job as the first Black woman welder in the company's Richmond shipyards. And her victory paved the way for thousands of women workers to secure better paying jobs in the Bay Area's booming shipyard industry. Albrier would go on to integrate Berkeley's League of Women Voters and the Red Cross. She was a prominent member of the National Council of Negro Women. Later in her life, she became a peace and disarmament activist and a pioneer fighting for the rights of senior citizens and people with disabilities. And to wrap up, we're coming back to Los Angeles with Charlotta Bass. We all know that California is the home to the first Black woman and South Asian woman to be Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. But California is also home to the first African-American woman to run for the office of Vice President. Charlotta Bass was the vice presidential candidate on the Progressive Party ticket with Vincent Hallinan in 1952. And she was also the crusading publisher of the largest African-American owned newspaper in the Western United States, the California Eagle, for 40 years. This picture was taken outside the office of the Eagle on Central Avenue in Los Angeles. And I'm going to wrap up there and say that this has been a small sampling of some Black women leaders who have helped shape California. And I want to thank you for sharing their histories with me.
Okay, Dave was slow to, there we go, I'm back. Hey, how you doing? Okay, let's see what we got in the Q&A here. Okay, remind us why women were so important in the African-American community in California.
Well, I think they were important because in African-American culture, women are encouraged to be active. And, you know, I've been doing some research and writing and having discussions about the suffragist movement and really sort of looking at some of the contrast between white suffragists and African-American suffragists, or white women's clubs and Black women's clubs. And one of the things that's very different, as I said, is that African-American women who are working class women, who are middle class women, are encouraged to give back. They're expected to give back to the community. They're expected to be active. They're expected often to work as a contribution. And they also have the support of their men. So if you look at the issue of suffrage, it was the position in the Black community. Universal suffrage was the position in the Black community for generations, the votes for all. But
And that was not true.
and that
for-
wasn't true among white people, and it wasn't true among white men. But Black men were one of the most consistent supporters of votes for all. So that meant that when the suffrage movement, the movement for women's rights would peak, there was support among Black men. And I mean, why do you think that the Seneca Falls Conference, the only man who was invited to the conference was Frederick Douglass?
Yeah.
Because as a spokesperson for the African-American freedom struggle, he had articulated the consistent support of votes for all. So partly what I'm saying is that there isn't any, I mean, Black women are expected to play leadership roles, and that may be why it looks as if they're being important, because that's just the expectation. And it is something that has developed in the political culture of African Americans.
So the title of your book, African Americans in the California Dream, I'd like to get a sense of you of the different motivating factors over the years for why African Americans sought that dream. What were the different factors over generations that brought African Americans to California?
Well, one way to understand it is that they came for the same reasons as everyone else.
Sunshine?
So for instance, during the gold rush, I mean, sunshine was a part of it. So that's the first thing, is just let's normalize this. They came for the same reasons everybody else did. Charlotta Bass, for instance, who grew up in Rhode Island, she came because for health reasons. And there were thousands and thousands of people who moved to especially Southern California if they had lung ailments and that kind of thing. That was a very popular thing to do. So whether it was for health reasons, during the gold rush for riches, African Americans shared all of those aspirations. They weren't any different than anybody else. But there was one difference, and that was because the country, the laws and the institutions of the United States differentiated African Americans because of slavery and because of Jim Crow. So people came also seeking greater freedom, greater rights. They had the hope that in this kind of unformed place, they might be able to help shape the way that society was going to develop.
But then many of them found the Klan not only in Mississippi and Alabama, but in Long Beach and Glendale.
Well, you're already in the 20th century.
Right.
So people started coming long before that and were settled here long before.
No, I hear you. I mean, am I missing something? It strikes me that the biggest migration of African Americans to California was World War II and thereafter.
Yes, but
that's
here's
sort of
the
the sense that I
problem,
have.
and part of the reason that I'm writing this book. My family, for instance, my mother's family, both sides, my grandmother and my grandfather on my mother's side, their families came to California in the 1890s. I'm a fourth generation Californian, and I grew up hearing people telling us that Black people came to California during World War II to work in the shipping, work in the defense industries. And I knew that wasn't true. And so we have a problem in California. Of course, not, the migration during World War II was everybody. Everybody came to California to work in the shipyards and work in the defense industries. All populations rushed into the state. And of course, among that huge boom in population during World War II was a big boom of Black migrants who were looking for jobs, but also because of racism, because of this former Confederacy, they were also fleeing Jim Crow. But remember, there was a huge population boom in the state. But it's important, I think, to understand even what happened during World War II, knowing the previous history, because who received those migrants? California had only the most fledgling infrastructure to deal with them. And it had plenty of its own sort of racial separation and Jim Crow practices. And it was the African-American community that was already established in California. Its institutions, its neighborhoods, its churches, its philanthropies that by and large received these migrants. So when people came, this famous wave of Black migrants during World War II, they didn't come into nothing. They came into a context that had actually been, newspapers and businesses and that had been already established for generations. And if you know people, people who've been in the state for a long time, some of us have networks. And my family is like latecomers compared to friends that I have whose family came during the gold rush. And we make jokes about that. And if you talk to people who've been in the state for a long time, they have different stories to tell. They can remember, if they're old enough, or if they had the memory passed down to them, what it was like when people Black people fled to California during World War II. And looking at, people who were interlopers in some ways. So history is much more interesting, much more complex. And what's established in California and the nature of California was so determined by these early settlers that part of the premise of my book is that we can't understand the state if we don't understand the role that these 19th century and early Black settlers played.
Okay, I'm going back to the questions. There's so much said about the lack of heroes for Black children. How well known are the heroines you discussed today among Black kids? Can greater awareness of these heroines help inspire children to stay involved in school and achieve?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I don't know the answer. My experience is that most people don't know much about history, about US history, and that includes young people. And I think that the experience of passing down Black history has changed a lot. The reason that many of us knew Black history is because we learned it from our families. We learned it in our churches and other institutions. We sang Lift Every Voice and Sing. We've been doing that for more than 100 years. So we passed our history along. And then eventually, because of social struggles, some of that trickled into curriculum in schools. And, you know, through campaigns like Black History Month and stuff like that, there's the effort to try to get the knowledge out there amongst a wider group. But I think, you know, kids used to learn some basic Black history at home and in community institutions and that kind of thing. But I don't think that's quite happening now the way that it used to. And I don't know what they do in the schools. So school was never the way of transmitting Black history.
It was in the family and the churches that happened. Is that your spin on it? Okay. So you mentioned the Buffalo Soldiers, and I know you don't know a lot about that particular area. And I think you have an upcoming exhibit at the museum about it. Why don't you talk to us a little about the soldiers and what we need to know and why we should go visit the coming exhibition at CAA.
Thank you. That is very kind of you to mention my exhibit. I have an exhibit that's going to be opening at the California African American Museum, CAM, April 13th. It's called For Race and Country, Buffalo Soldiers in California. The title is taken from the signature, the way that Charles Young, who was the first Black colonel in the US Army, the way he used to sign his photographic portraits, For Race and Country. And it's a very important conceptually because it describes what W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, the double consciousness among African Americans, the split and the coexistence between being a patriot and being a resistor, that tension that people live in. And certainly if you are in the armed forces. So the exhibit also is looking at how these regiments shaped, literally in some places, the physical shape of California. And it looks at the role that the four regiments, the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantries, the roles they played in building some of California's national parks, like Yosemite and Sequoia National Park, and the work that they did in the giant forest. It looks at the role of these Black regiments in establishing the all-Black town of Allensworth, which is now a state historic park.
Which is where? Where is it?
It's in the Central Valley. It's 40 miles north of Bakersfield in Tulare County. And it's an extraordinary place. It's part of the Black Town movement in the United States. And it looks at the role that the soldiers played providing the first presidential escort for Teddy Roosevelt in San Francisco in 1903, and churches that were built, and it looks at the lasting things that you can point to today that are still there as a result of the work that they did while they were stationed here in California, or maybe after they retired and were out of uniform.
I don't know what the Black Town movement is. Give us a little bit about that.
Well, it's something I actually coined that phrase to
Okay, so we'll
describe.
quote as Susan Anderson has said,
Right.
the Black Town movement.
But it describes something real that started after Reconstruction. You know, at the end of Reconstruction, when the federal troops were pulled out of the South, and the Klan, the first rise of the Klan, and Jim Crow laws and the Black codes and the violence and the terror were reestablished in the South, Black people left the South in droves, starting in the 1870s and 1880s, and they mostly went west to Kansas and Oklahoma and parts of Texas. And and this was probably, if not, this might have been the first major refugee crisis in US history. So many Black people left the South
So
that there were
as Reconstruction was rolled back, that's the first widespread immigration to the Western United States, in your view.
Exactly,
Okay.
starting in the 1870s. And it was, in fact, the people that went to Kansas were called exodusters. It was common knowledge. It was part of the culture, the knowledge of this. There was something called Kansas fever. You can see the handbills that were printed to get people to places in Kansas and Oklahoma. And there were so many Black people left the South in a short period of time that the United States Senate held hearings on the crisis. And some of the leaders of the exodus, like Pap Singleton and others, testified before the Senate. Pap Singleton was one of the people who helped establish multiple towns in Kansas. And Oklahoma was another state where many Black towns were established. And some of them are still around as national parks. Texas had at least 500 Black settlements.
You're kidding. Are we
I'm
talking
not.
East Texas or you don't know more specifically?
All over the state, including West Texas. And there's a wonderful scholar in Texas at, now I'm forgetting her university, who has documented these settlements. And it's a continuing project, and she's doing some wonderful work. But there have been Black towns established in the United States since the end of the 18th century. And they all had pretty much the same goals. They had different levels of sophistication. Some of them were just settlements, or some of them were near labor camps, or some of them were partly because of segregation. Others were very sophisticated, like Boley in Oklahoma, or Allensworth in the Central Valley, where they had their own judicial district, school district, voting district. They established the first branch library in Tulare County, and that sort of thing. But they all had the similar goals. One of the goals was to be safe. The United States is a very dangerous and threatening place for Black people. So they wanted to be amongst people where they felt safe and away from white violence. Another thing was, as Jim Crow developed and the idea that Black people could not govern themselves, were not worthy of citizenship, another motivating factor for establishing these towns was to prove that they were capable of doing the best at as citizens. They were capable of doing and being everything, as Colonel Allensworth said. So Allensworth was established in 1908, kind of at the tail end of this movement. After that period of time, there weren't that many Black towns that were established.
Okay, so a question from the audience. I have a good friend, now deceased, whose grandfather was a Black cowboy. Did you run across a lot of those in your research?
Yes, people who may not have, we didn't have big cattle ranches in California, although we do now, but they're dairy cattle, right? Did you know California is the dairy capital of the United States?
I did know that, but it's by pure happenstance that I do.
we have more dairy cows than any place, which is really different than a cattle ranch, right? But so we didn't have, there were cowboys here, there were vaqueros, all cowboys are based on that Mexican, Spanish, New World tradition. And there definitely were ranchers, different kinds of sheep ranchers and turkey ranchers and others in California history that that had stabled horses and mastered horsemanship, but it wasn't the same as being a working cowboy, for the cattle ranchers, if that makes any sense. There's a lot of that kind of history in California, but they weren't cowboys in the same sense as they were maybe in Texas.
So I'd like to get your sense of the importance or how you evaluate the Tom Bradley phenomenon in Los Angeles. Have you spent a lot of time on that? And if so, I'd like you to sort of give us sort of your view about how to think about Bradley and his importance.
Well, I'm definitely writing about Bradley in the book. I'm not there yet. First of all, I knew Tom Bradley, and I spent about 10 years in a nonprofit organization 30 years ago that worked very closely with his office. And I got a chance to work closely with him on affordable housing and economic development in neighborhoods. And so that's one piece.
Did that make you a fan?
Pardon?
Were you favorably impressed with him as a result of that experience?
As a mayor, Tom Bradley completely transformed Los Angeles.
That's what I'm looking for. Tell us.
I mean, first of all, for me, it's a combination of memory and studying the period, because I remember what LA used to be like before he was mayor. And I'm going to tell you that there's nothing inevitable there. If you looked at LA before 1973, when Tom Bradley was elected the first time, there was nothing inevitable about LA becoming a global city. LA was a hick town. It was run by a racist, a very limited imagination. It was run by, an institute, this sort of backward white institutional point of view. And Bradley was, first of all, elected to the city council. And I don't know if people know this. This is what I'm going to be writing about in the book. He was elected because the Black community wanted him. There were conventions that leadership in Black LA held to decide who was going to be the person that the Black community united behind to break the color barrier on the city council in Los Angeles. And there was competition. Tom Bradley it wasn't his, he had to win it. Bishop H.H. Brookins, he was a candidate. And there are people like Bob Farrell, who's still around, who remember these conventions. But Tom Bradley, he became the #1 choice. And the leadership of all the different institutions, churches, influential bodies, closed ranks behind Tom Bradley when they ran him for the 10th district. And they chose the right person because in addition to this unified force, I remember when Antonio Villaraigosa ran for mayor the first time and he lost. And I had written, I used to write opinion pieces for the Los Angeles Times, and I wrote about part of the reason he lost was the Latino vote was split. And he came to me and said later, after that piece came out, if the Latino community had lined up for me the way the Black community lined up for Tom Bradley the first time, I would have won. And I said, yeah, that was my point. So the community was united. And as I said, they picked the right person because Tom Bradley got on the council and he looked around and he decided that he was going to be a leader for the whole city. And he started holding meetings in every council district on community safety issues, on a range of issues. And nobody, a lot of people are very arrogant. Racism can make you arrogant, and people they underestimated. He was building a base in every council district in the city of Los Angeles. And that was his hallmark, is he knew how to build coalitions. And we know, because of Rafe Sonnenschein's scholarship and others, that the big coalition of African-American, Jewish residents, labor, came together behind Bradley when he finally ran for mayor. But it's really important to know what happened before he appeared as the candidate for mayor. When I was a curator in UCLA Library Special Collections, UCLA Library has the Tom Bradley administration papers. And it was my honor and my pleasure to raise money from the Haynes Foundation to work with archivists to make that collection more accessible. And now there's a beautiful, if anybody wants to Google Tom Bradley papers or Tom Bradley finding aid, you can get access to his papers at UCLA. So I wrote a piece years ago. There was a group of us that contributed to a book called The City, Los Angeles and Urban Theory at the end of the 20th century. And I wrote a chapter that looked at Bradley and other issues in Black Los Angeles. And I definitely have criticisms of him. I do write about his shortcomings of his administration and, the kind of almost really tragic way that he went out of office after the civil unrest and that kind of thing. But there's no question that the city transformed because of him. He had a vision of LA being a global leader, of being a cultural mecca. Richard Kashalik, who was the first director of MoCA, told me that the way that MoCA was built was Tom Bradley took Richard by hand and walked him to all of the corporate offices downtown to raise money for MoCA. So he did have a vision, and he was quiet. It's hard to, he wasn't a blabbermouth and a grandstander, so people don't always realize that about him, but he was a visionary, and he loved Los Angeles. He lived here, lived in LA his entire life.
There's a little sub aspect of LA African-American politics that I'd like to ask you about, and maybe you know things about it, maybe you don't. I mean, in the 60s, there was, in my view, extraordinary friction between certain Black nationalists, generally the largest of which was an organization called US, which was run by a fellow named Ron Karenga, and the Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panther Party. Very extreme tensions between those organizations, a shootout that occurred at UCLA. Have you looked at that period, and what conclusions, if so, what conclusions have you reached about that animosity?
Yeah, I mean, I've done less research about that. I'm definitely aware of it. There are people who are better able to talk about it because, so for instance, I know the person who was the president of the Black Students Union at UCLA when that shooting happened. A lot of the people that were involved in this shooting are still around. And it was ugly. I don't have as I said, I haven't done a lot of research on it though. So I'm not really sure what to say, except that it was really ugly and it was really vicious. And the experience of the Panthers in LA was pretty different than it was in Northern California also.
Yeah, I mean, in the Bay Area, the Panthers were a different organization, certainly than they were in Los Angeles. I would, and obviously the Bay Area was the founding institution where Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and those fellows all came up through Oakland and all of that. Well, we really appreciate your time. We wish you the best of luck with your book. I'm sure it'll be a great success. Some of the questions suggest that there just hasn't been enough of these stories told, and I think that the people in Los Angeles, people in Plato will look for your book, and maybe we'll even have an SDG about your book and get folks looking at it for 7 or 14 weeks. So again, we really appreciate you stopping by. Okay, next time, boys and girls, see you, Susan. Next month we're off. Okay, so if you show up for a colloquium in April, you're going to be it's going to be a small crew. So the next organized one via Zoom webinar will be on Thursday, May 19th at 1:30, and our speaker will be Men Ying Pei, who's a Claremont McKenna College professor, the Tom and Margot Pritzker Professor of Government and the director of the Keck Center for International Strategic Studies. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and previously was a senior associate at the China program at the Carnegie Endowment. He is an international expert on democratization in developing countries, economic reform and governance in China, and the US-China relations. So with all the hot and heavy stuff going on in Ukraine and what China's input to that all is certainly going to be of some interest to us, I think, by May. His topic is the challenges on the US-China relationship. This guy really knows his stuff. Be there or be square. So we will see you then. Thanks, everybody.